Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. It is Thursday, and basically it's like, choose your adventure. Which crazy do you want to talk about? I devoted my newsletter today to the crazy down in Arizona. I made the judgment call not to inflict all of these sound bites on listeners of this podcast, but you can read shortish transcripts in morning shots where I did describe Carrie Lake as a groomer of crazy. Why should they have the name, especially when you have this metastasizing lunacy going on down in Arizona? But today, let's focus on some rather strange stories that are happening up on Capitol Hill. And we are joined by Dana Milbank, a nationally syndicated op-ed columnist for the Washington Post, who is speaking to us from the nation's capital right now. So good morning, Dana.
Good morning. I'd like you to refer to me as a groomer of crazy.
A groomer of crazy. I would prefer to be a groomer of sanity. But so, what are you doing at the Capitol today? Just tell us.
Well, Charlie, I've actually sort of assigned myself a new beat. Speaking of grooming crazy, I am planning to spend the better part of the next year watching the House of Representatives, in particular the Senate as well, but the Republicans with their 4-seat majority, and just how they're going to pull that off and what chaos is going to ensue. So I am indeed in the belly of the beast today. I'll be heading over to Pelosi's weekly press conference right after this, but there's a nice little soundproof booth right off the House floor in the third floor press gallery here. So it's a marvel of technology.
Well, make sure you let us know when you need to leave to go and cover actual news after we're done with all this rank punditry. So it occurs to me that we're in this very, very strange moment right now where the Republicans have just won control of the House of Representatives, but they are in absolute, complete disarray, whereas the Democrats, who have spent the last 50 years modeling being in disarray, are in remarkable array. Could just take a moment to talk about how the fact that you had a changing of the generational guard among House Democrats, and it was unanimous. The knives were not out. There was not a lot of, things being thrown up against the wall. And they have a new leader, and he was elected by acclamation. So it can just reflect on this sort of strange reversal of fate that we're seeing on Capitol Hill.
Yes, that's exactly what I've been seeing all week here. And yes, of course, it's the opposite of what you'd expect. But really, yes, Republicans won the House, but Democrats won the election in the sense that there was no wave. And if you thought the Democrats had difficulty governing with a 5-seat majority, well, wait till you see Kevin McCarthy with a 4-seat majority. So, I think it's not just the disarray, it's the mood of things, in the House Democratic caucus meetings, there's hugs and smiles and handshakes and backslapping. I think they feel that certainly that they dodged a bullet there, but also that they're maybe just beginning to break the MAGA craziness that's going on. And of course, then you've got Kevin McCarthy, who I guess he's more likely to be speaker than anybody else is, but he's got these 5 hard no votes right now. He's got a month to try to convince a hard no to be a squishy maybe. But, and there's said to be maybe 20 who aren't so keen on going along with his speakership. So he's basically going to spend the next month giving things away to them. He may well give away things that make it even more impossible to govern. Is there going to be this motion to vacate the chair, which basically means they've got a gun to his head, and at any point, any member can demand a vote of no confidence in Kevin McCarthy. And, this week, we actually had a vote of no confidence in Kevin McCarthy, and it was cast by Kevin McCarthy because he's getting on board with passing this omnibus, this massive spending bill now. So he doesn't have to do it in January. You would think if you were confident in your leadership, you'd want a short-term spending extension so you could enact the big spending bill in January when you take over. But Kevin McCarthy has no confidence in Kevin McCarthy's ability to get that through the House. And I think that's sound judgment on his part. I have no idea how he's going to govern the place. So Democrats are now in the minority. They have one task, and that is going to be to thwart Kevin McCarthy, which is a much easier task than trying to govern with a 4-seat majority.
I think you've already answered my question, but I just don't see how this works. I don't see how, first of all, let's talk about Kevin McCarthy becoming the speaker. There are 20 quasi hard no votes. Now, technically, he does not need 218 votes to be elected speaker, right? That if they decide not to vote, if they don't show up or they abstain, he can win the speakership with a smaller number of votes. First of all, that's correct, right?
Yes, he needs a majority of the votes cast. So
of the votes cast. But in terms of actually governing now, because there are a lot of quasi-centrists to the extent that we can describe anyone in the Republican Party as a centrist, there are at least a dozen or more newly elected Republicans from crossover districts that were won by Joe Biden that might not want to go along with the crazy caucus. And so he's going to have to find a way to square the circle. He's also going to have to find a way to make deals that, might be compromises with the Biden administration. And that nothing outrages or stokes up the perpetual outrage machine more than compromising with Democrats. And that Donald Trump, who's got no skin in the game, is just going to be throwing turd bombs from Mar-a-Lago at him anytime he actually wants to make a deal. So how does it work?
Absolutely. And one of the other rules that appears likely, certainly possible, and I would say likely that they're going to impose on McCarthy, is that he can't bring anything to the floor unless it has a majority of the caucus. And that's very significant because think about what's happening with the rail bill. They had the vote in the House here yesterday, and Republicans got up on the floor and said, yes, it's terrible. It's a Biden failure that we're all here, but it would be absolutely catastrophic to have this rail strike, a loss of $2 billion a day to the country. So we've got to support this. And what happened? Well, 40% of the Republican caucus made that sensible vote. 60% of them said, no, we're going to vote against this. We would rather have an economic calamity than have any sort of a reasonable compromise right now. And I think that's probably a good proxy for what you're looking at. 40% of the Republican caucus, I wouldn't say they're moderate, but they're sort of in the reality-based community. 60% not there at all, willing to inflict economic calamity rather than do anything that might appear to be compromising or voting with or endorsing the Biden agenda. So, how do you govern in that way? So, yeah, you mentioned there are a few moderates, and they can be just as much, you only need 5 of them, the way things look now, to throw the entire vote off kilter. So they can screw things up just as easily as the Freedom Caucus can do. It just seems that when you only have 4 votes to play with and 2/3 of your membership is kind of wackadoodle, I don't see how you govern in any situation. I don't see how you compromise with the Democrats. I don't see how you placate the mainstream Republicans and the Freedom Caucus. Even with a 20 or 30 seat majority, it was, which is the sort of thing that Paul Ryan and John Boehner had. They couldn't handle it. Now, Kevin McCarthy, who is a bear of very little brain, I would say, compared to Boehner or Paul Ryan, dealing with a fraction of their majority.
To get a little bit more specific, what happens with aid to Ukraine? Because I think that there's a strong bipartisan majority that would support aid for Ukraine. But with the Hastert rule, is Kevin McCarthy going to be able to get a majority of the caucus to move ahead on that? And even if he did that, what will Donald Trump say from Mar-a-Lago? I mean, all of these things seem to be, unanswered questions, his ability to do that. So what is your sense on Ukraine?
Yeah,
because obviously that's a life and death issue that they're going to have to confront very shortly.
Now, I mentioned the rail strike bill.
Yeah.
Now, notably, McCarthy and Scalise voted with the 60% of the crazy caucus that said, no, we'd rather have economic calamity than vote with the Democrats on this bill. Ukraine may be just on the other side of the line, so maybe a portion of the crazy caucus will side with the sensible caucus. Certainly Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise are on the side of not abandoning our allies allies in Ukraine and handing the place over to Vladimir Putin. But McCarthy has also said it's going to be difficult. So, I mean, I think the compromise he's working out now is, all kinds of investigations of how the money is being spent in Ukraine. And when you look at the list of investigations that they're preparing to pursue, whether that's, against Mayorkas at DHS or, the 8 different Hunter Biden investigations, investigating where the money is going in Ukraine actually is a perfectly sensible one. So it would surprise me, even in this broken caucus, in this broken House that they're going to have, if they couldn't get support for Ukraine. But it'll probably be like everything else, a much noisier process and a far lengthier one. And everything's going to be done in a state of suspense because you won't actually know what's going to happen until you get out there on the floor.
And also with a very, very short leash, which was on display this week. We spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about Trump's dinner with Nick, dining with Nazis, and the fallout from that. So Mitch McConnell comes out yesterday or the day before, I've lost track of days now, and without prompting, rips Trump, saying that he's not likely to be elected president again. Interestingly enough, he said he's not likely to be elected. He did not say, and therefore should never be elected president again, but we take what we can get.
He's a pundit too. You could have him on the Bulwark podcast.
Well, exactly. That was more punditry than moral leadership. But there was a little bit of contrast between his approach and Kevin McCarthy. So could you talk about this? I mean, McCarthy has this incredibly complicated dance. He's got to do a kabuki dance on a tightrope here, right, with Donald Trump.
It really is. And of course, Kevin McCarthy is not quite as eloquent, shall we say, as McConnell. So, he'll start a sentence and you have no idea what hurdles of syntax await him. So you have no idea how the sentence will end. So even if he's trying to convey something, it may not come across that way. But yes, I think there was Tuesday when they both spoke out on this. So you had McConnell being, well, okay, it was punditry, but it was still fairly clear that he disapproved of Donald Trump meeting with these, anti-Semites. McCarthy got up there outside the West Wing of the White House in front of the cameras and said, Trump denounced these people, which was not true.
Which was clearly not true.
Yeah. Right. Did he think it was true? I have no idea. But that was his sort of default position. It was that nobody should be meeting with these characters. And Trump definitely knows that and denounces them. So it was, he was trying to say, okay, we are not on board with the leaders of our party sitting down to white tablecloth meals with white supremacists, but he was just unable to show any daylight with Trump. So I think that's the difference that you've had from McConnell, who's not a profile in courage either, but is at least willing to take on the slings and arrows from Mar-a-Lago. So McCarthy clearly can't afford to do that now. Maybe he will after he gets his speakership, but if he's going to be on this being able to have a no confidence vote at any point, well, then every day is basically his leadership is going to be on the line. They've floated some sorts of compromises, like they might give him a 6 or 7 month honeymoon before they all start the votes of no confidence. And then if somebody calls for a vote of no confidence, then they have to wait 60 days before calling the next one. But it's a question of, is his hanging going to come every 24 hours, or are they going to, give him brief respites in between?
Going back to the theme of Republicans in disarray, I know you do as well, spend some time on MAGA media, or it's not MAGA media necessarily, but, MAGA adjacent media, conservative media. And I'm really, really struck again by the amount of agita post-election that you're seeing there, despite winning control of the House, and the disarray that you're seeing everywhere. The stories out of Georgia, when people are, realizing this Herschel Walker campaign, amazingly, is not working out very well. He's not campaigning. He's completely incoherent. We have more stories of girlfriends that he's attacking. He is being outspent overwhelmingly. That is not going well, amazingly. You have a fight at the RNC with people saying, Ronna McDaniel has been a complete disaster. We're going to give her another term. And the only alternative to her, apparently, is my pillow guy, Mike Lindell. And it seems like one thing after another that is afflicting them. And then there's one thing that I don't want to gloss over, since you're up on Capitol Hill, how really, and I guess with a little bit of historical perspective, how amazing it was that you had a supermajority vote in the United States Senate this week to approve a same-sex marriage bill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you and I both remember when that would have been politically toxic, but you had, was it 10 or was it 11 Republicans that voted in favor of this legislation? Most Republicans voted no, as you might expect.
Yeah, but
But
I think it was 62 votes in favor, so
right.
that's a considerable number.
In terms of real outrage in the right-wing media, because they have gone all in on the whole idea of, gay marriage and transsexuals. This is a massive defeat for them. I mean, this is an extraordinary moment. It's an extraordinary moment for bipartisanship, and it's really a repudiation of much of what the MAGA right, has been banking on
Yes.
as their golden ticket. So you have any thoughts about that? Because it's really quite a transformation of public opinion, too.
I agree with your larger point, although I would personally very much enjoy seeing my pillow guy as the head of the RNC. I think that would be
from your lips to God's ear.
That would be
absolutely.
That would be thoroughly fitting. I was able to get an exclusive interview with him at Trump's rollout at Mar-a-Lago. He's very, very tight-lipped fellow, but he did say he wants to. His agenda was melting down the voting machines and turning them into prison bars, I guess, for the election workers. Of course,
I would have thought bullets, but prison bars is good.
He didn't specify that. That part of the agenda was left unclear. But you are right. It's not just the election, the smaller wave than expected in the House, the fact that the Democrats kept the Senate. I think it was because of the very clear repudiation of the MAGA Republicanism when you look at particularly all the Secretary of State candidates that went down and the gubernatorial candidates who went down, like in Arizona and in Pennsylvania. So it wasn't just that it didn't work out very well for the Republicans. It showed that the horse they've been riding for the last 6 years is, it may be time to head off to the glue maker. That, I think, is the source of the disarray right now. And I think that is why you're actually able to see some progress here. You talked about gay marriage, progress on a spending bill, maybe progress on this rail strike. A whole bunch of other things are happening. So I think the will has been broken to some extent of the MAGA crowd. Now, I don't take this as altogether good news that they may not be able to prevail anymore, but Donald Trump and those Trumpists have more than enough power to bollocks everything up still. I mean, they will be able to effectively bring things to a halt as we go ahead into this next Congress.
This raises an interesting question that I wanted to get your take on. A.B. Stoddard has a great piece in the Bulwark today reminding Republicans that Donald Trump is not going to graciously go away. He is not going to concede, that Donald Trump will burn it all down if he cannot control the party. And I guess this is the one thing that I think that a lot of both pundits and Republican wishcasters have yet really to grapple with, which is what do you do with a problem like Donald Trump? He's in the race. He never acknowledges defeat. Ron DeSantis may be the great hope down in Florida. We can get to him in a moment. But, what is your take on this? I mean, how does the Republican Party move past Donald Trump if Donald Trump has made it perfectly clear that he will pull the temple down around him, that he will burn everything down?
And he's uniquely good at that, Charlie. I mean, if you think about it, look at the wreckage around this man of all the people who have supported him, who have wound up in prison or disgraced or defeated or some combination of those things. And in each case, you see who walks away from the wreckage is Donald Trump. Character assassination is his unique gift. Look, DeSantis may be able to prevail against him in a Republican presidential nomination battle, but Trump's ability to destroy the reputation and the image of people is really second to none. And so I think we have only begun to see a little bit, Trump is sort of debuting lines of attack. So I think that is true, and that has to be kept in mind, that he has the ability to destroy. I have no idea what Republicans do about this. They had years in which, as you know, that they could have done something about it, but I don't think. Suppose he doesn't command 80 or 90% of the base, but only half of the base. Well, that's still enough to cause mayhem every
Well,
which
that
way. And
yeah.
he has no loyalty other than to Donald Trump. So there's no moral or political imperative to not to do that.
All the focus is on what a big winner Ron DeSantis was down in Florida, which is true. But also, I think it's an underappreciated story that Brian Kemp in Georgia defied Donald Trump very, very directly and was
Hmm.
excommunicated by Donald Trump, who supported a primary opponent to him. Brian
Hmm.
Kemp blew the Trump-backed opponent out in the primary and then won handily in the general election. So if you're looking for a
Right.
Republican that can survive Trumpism, Brian Kemp has actually, of all of these guys that are out there, has actually is the one guy that has done it, hasn't he? You can defy Trump and survive, and he proved that.
Yes. And Brian Kemp will have another data point after the special election. Does Herschel Walker go down in flames without Kemp on the ticket with
Hmm.
him? That's actually a
That's
laboratory
very interesting.
experiment of what was bringing out voters and who wasn't bringing out voters. So we'll have the answers to that very shortly. But yeah, but also in Florida, I mean, let's be clear: the Democrats really didn't contest Florida. They had candidates, they had serious candidates on the ballot, but they really weren't working. They weren't pouring money in there, the party or Democratic donors. They weren't doing get out the vote efforts. They weren't working with Latino voters because of
Mm.
the assumption of defeat. I think that was a mistake, but Florida was very much not in play. So I think that artificially magnifies the size of DeSantis's win
Well,
there.
DeSantis is he's not necessarily the front runner, but he's sort of the pundit's front runner, and now he's getting the front runner treatment. I don't know whether you've had a chance to read Mark Leibovich's treatment of him in the
I've
Atlantic.
started. I
It's a
took
great
it. Yeah.
read, basically saying, maybe from a distance he looks really formidable, but up close and personal, maybe not so much. And I guess this is one of those moments where you have to remember all of the other guys that were trotted out as front runners, as great hopes, who then fizzled in the presidential spotlight. And we
Hmm.
Ron DeSantis has just not been remotely tested yet, has he?
Yeah, this is true. And I mean, probably the best thing for Ron DeSantis would be if it's a Ron DeSantis versus Donald Trump nomination fight, because the reason we had Donald Trump in 2016 was because there were, I don't know, 15 or 18 of them, but and there were several serious ones, but none of them was able to get a clean shot at Trump. He was able to pick them off one at a time. Whereas if I'm still convinced if Republican voters had been given the choice between Donald Trump or not Donald Trump, they would have chosen that. But I don't think they ever had that choice because it was carved up among so many others. So and that could easily happen again. Anybody who's saying Donald Trump cannot win the Republican nomination, I think is being a bit too hopeful. Of course he
Yeah,
can.
of course he can. Okay, let's go back to the House Republicans. Since you were up on Capitol Hill, you described the House under the GOP as the crazies take the wheel. And in particular, this press conference, this announcement by Jim Jordan and James Comer from Kentucky, announcing all of their multiple probes into the president's son, Hunter Biden. I'm going to admit that I've made the strategic decision not to focus on Hunter Biden until we get some evidence that, in fact, it's relevant to anything. But it seems hard to overstate the absolute obsession of House Republicans with Hunter Biden. Where is this going, and can it actually do damage to Joe Biden, or are Republicans just going to be clown themselves?
I, I think your last question answers itself, Charlie, based on history. But so that Comer was kind of revealing as he talked about this, because he said several times, "This is about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
He's the big guy." Apparently, according to something in the on the Hunter Biden laptop. They tried to draw that link, and it was because I don't know, Hunter asked for office space for Joe Biden, or various other, glancing references like that. But then he sort of gave the game away when reporters started asking questions about other topics, the January 6th, other things of interest. And Comer says, can we please get back to Hunter Biden? With Hunter Biden, it's very important. And I said, wait a second, you were just saying this is not about Hunter, it was about Joe Biden. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose, look, Joe Biden has many flaws, and the flaws will be apparent for all to see, assuming he's running for re-election. But corruption is really not chief among them. So, look, if the Justice Department, more likely them than the clownish House Republicans, find some link, well, we'll all be surprised by that. But, it's sort of, I think we can stipulate that Hunter Biden, whatever the legal ramifications are, is a pretty sleazy guy, had troubles with addiction, got into all kinds of bad stuff. We know that. It is baked into the cake. So it all comes down to the ability to prove somehow that Joe Biden was calling all the shots here, which is sort of goes against everything that we've heard and seen over the years. So, I mean, so that's they figured, look, that's what they have at the moment. It was Benghazi against Hillary Clinton until it turned the Benghazi probe unmasked the email server. So, it's a question of this is what they've got for now, and they'll see what documents are turned over and see what other direction that might send them.
No, I think it's worth remembering that the Benghazi hearings ultimately did torpedo Hillary Clinton.
They did, not for Benghazi.
No, right.
But
No, but they,
right.
Yeah, exactly, because of other things. I mean, so that did have that effect, and I think that's part of their memory. So there's another wild card here, and I don't know how this is going to play. Before the election, we had the Hunter Biden laptop story, which most of the media decided was not a legitimate story. It was a bogus story, ignored it. It now turns out not to have been a bogus story. So will there be the temptation on the part of the media now to overcompensate, having not thrown the flag on the original laptop story, to overhype anything that comes out about Hunter Biden now as kind of a make good?
I suppose there may be some of that, but look, and the Post did an exhaustive look at the laptop. Were people misled by the FBI and others, as the Republicans claim, before the election about the legitimacy of the laptop? I don't know. There certainly were many doubts about the authenticity of it back then. But the Post and others have done a re-look at the laptop, knowing that it is maybe not everything involved in this is legitimate, but it is at core legitimate. There still is no Joe Biden evidence in there. What Jim Jordan's talking about now is not really the laptop, but whistleblowers. We have whistleblowers. We have 18 whistleblowers, apparently. So, okay, well, if they, if they've indeed got whistles and goods, well, I guess we'll be hearing from them. But if, they're blowing silly kazoos, I suppose we're going to hear about that too.
Let's look ahead a little bit. One of the next big things that's going to happen in Congress, of course, they have a very, very busy lame duck session here, but sometime in the next 4 weeks, maybe the next 3 weeks, we'll get the final report from the January 6th committee. What do you expect from that? And will that make any difference? I mean, that's the question we've been asking since the beginning. I also wonder, whether or not the conviction of the Oath Keeper leaders on seditious conspiracy charges puts a little wind in their sails at the moment. What do you think?
I think regardless of the committee, that the Stewart Rhodes conviction, I think, is hugely important. And of course, the MAGA crowd will say, attack the jury process and say that it's tainted because it's in the nation's capital. But, this is real. January 6th was sedition. That is official. That's no longer, if it ever was, a judgment call. So I think that's hugely important in its own right. The January 6th committee did, I think, yeoman's work over the summer with their hearings. There will be another bite at the apple here. I don't expect, certainly based on what we saw at the last hearing, that they necessarily have anything new other than a narrative that will be important to have out there for posterity. Now, maybe they could, could they work out something with Ways and Means and just throw in an appendix there and here are 6 years of Trump's tax returns?
Okay, what do? Yeah, I mean, are we ever going to see those tax returns? And if we did, I mean, hasn't that really been baked into the cake? Don't we kind of know what the deal is there? Or
Right. It would be like, we are shocked that Hunter Biden
Right.
was involved in sleazy shenanigans. Right. I think the only shock would be if they'd release them and we found out that he'd actually given a fortune to veterans charities or something like that. That would fundamentally change our view of him. No, I mean, I look, who knows? Maybe they'll figure out some way. I think it probably would not look good for them to just dump the taxes out there right now, since they've spent years in court arguing that it was for a legislative purpose. When the Roberts Court did, they can technically say they forced the executive to give that up. So it'll be a precedent for future Congresses, but it's of very little use to them now in terms of legislation. So I think it would be gutsy to put it out right now and controversial. But I've given up on predictions. I've surrendered my prediction.
I think that's a sound life choice. So I don't want to dwell on the whole Nick Fuentes dinner, because I think that we've litigated that pretty extensively and will continue to do so. But, you take a step back, and I noticed that back in October, before any of this happened, you wrote about American Jews starting to think the unthinkable. And I guess the point here is that anti-Semitism has now, I want to be careful about this. It's always been a factor. It's always been there. But, as I was discussing with Peter Weiner earlier this week, I just get the feeling that it's gotten more oxygen and is more dangerous than any time in my lifetime. That something that we thought, was this, sleeping evil has now arisen again. And it's getting a lot more traction than any of us ever would have imagined and maybe even realized at the moment. So talk to me about this, why you wrote about this back in October.
Yeah, it's a very important and troubling thing. I mean, for me as a Jew, but for all of us, I mean, Jews are often the canary in the coal mine, in terms of an intolerant society. Yeah, my rabbi at Yom Kippur services just asked for a show of hands of how many of you have thought about, where do we go if we can't stay here? And I'm one of the people who have had those thoughts. Ultimately, I come back to the reasoning that if it's not safe here, it's not going to be safe anywhere. It's not going to be safe in Israel or Europe or anywhere else. This is where a liberal democracy of free people have to make their stand for law and order, for equal justice. And if it fails here, certainly we can't count on it anywhere else. But, I would say, half or more of the people were raising their hands in my synagogue. And I talked to Jonathan Greenblatt at the Anti-Defamation League, and he says it's among the most common questions he's getting. And this is something that would never contemplated,
No.
certainly in my lifetime. Anti-Semitic incidents, as the ADL counts them, I think it was a tripling since 2015 when Trump came down the escalator. And it remains at record high levels. And it's important to point out, this is not just Nick Fuentes and the right. It's the BDS movement that often bleeds into anti-Semitism on the left, particularly on college campuses. That's been a problem too. But I think we've seen what Trump did here was just the latest example of this, but it's been happening since Charlottesville and the many anti-Semitic actions of Donald Trump in the years before them. So people have been scolding Republicans or scolding Trump for this. To me, it goes beyond politics, and what's happening is these people have been pulled into the mainstream. It has been legitimized. So now we're talking about Holocaust denial, as if this deserves a place in any American discussion. So they have been emboldened. They've emboldened the Daily Stormer and neo-Nazis, just as they've emboldened QAnon and Proud Boys and Stuart Rhodes and all the rest of them.
And this happened before the 2016 election. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about that during that campaign. And some of the people that have become the anti-Trumpers were raising alarms about Donald Trump's wink-wink alliance with some of those people even before he was elected president. So, I mean, none
Absolutely.
of this.
Yes, indeed. And, it was sort of subtle at first. It was the retweeting
Right.
of people. It was the use of, remember, there was that questionable use of Jewish star atop a pile of
I do
money.
remember
Was that
this.
an accident? Then there were the ads about George Soros and other financiers,
Mm-hmm.
globalists. So they were anti-Semitic overtones. There was Trump going before a Jewish audience and saying, "You won't support me because I don't want your
Mm-hmm.
money." His response, is, "Yeah, I've got a Jewish daughter and and grandchildren, and no doubt some of his best friends are black,"
Yeah.
which explain nothing. So we've seen that over and over again. People like Richard Spencer was saying in 2016, we have a psychic connection with Donald Trump. They were saying, he completes us, and this is before Charlottesville. I think the anti-Semitism, maybe compared to the anti-immigrant stuff, the pure racism directed at Latinos, Asians, Black Americans, that was less subtle. But I think it's now inevitably, it's not just sort of this undertone; it's now the melody of MAGA
I
republicanism.
think that's right. And also the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking, because that always seems to end up with the Jews behind it. And, even though Nick Fuentes is clear, sort of a neo-Nazi, he's the exclamation point on that story. The real, I think, problem is the fact that Trump actually did want to have dinner with Kanye West, who is an amazingly famous, wealthy,
Mm-hmm.
successful pop culture figure who has been trafficking in vile anti-Semitism. And as a result, I often think of, anti-Semitism as being the recessive gene out there, that's always been out there, but we're able to safely, keep it at arm's length or suppress it. But what's happening
Mm-hmm.
now, I fear, is that it's being introduced to a whole new generation in a whole new ways, that
Mm-hmm.
you have millions of people that have now been drawn into this conspiracy mindset who are now being exposed to people saying, and who's behind it. So that you have social
Mm-hmm.
media platforms, you have younger voices, you have pop culture voices that are now introducing this ancient evil to a completely new set of people. And so that it's
Mm-hmm.
not just the revival of what has been there all along. It does feel like it's metastasizing in a way that we don't fully. I don't think that we fully grasp the extent of it or the danger, even after we've seen this dramatic uptick in anti-Jewish violence.
Yes. And the other piece of that is we are losing our living historical memory of the
Yes.
Holocaust. That is almost gone already. It's not being taught. Alarming numbers of young people are really not clear about what that was all about. So it's sort of virgin territory that the conspiracy theorists are clear to conquer. But it's perhaps no different from what we're hearing about every other racial, religious, ethnic minority in America. But of course, there are centuries and centuries of practice at this. And it is sort of, it sounds ludicrous to talk about Jewish space lasers and other things that sound like the protocols of the elders of Zion. So, and I think, I have a tendency to say, oh, come on, how can people possibly believe that? But of course, now that we we know exactly what people can possibly believe about ivermectin and voting machines,
That's
so
a great
why
point.
wouldn't they
We
believe
are
that?
living through in real time a demonstration of what people are capable of believing. So when someone says, "Oh, you're being paranoid if you think X, Y, and Z," look, I'm listening to a lot of the conservatives who are pushing back on criticism of, Marjorie Taylor Greene by saying, "Well, what about Elon Omar?" The
Mm-hmm.
whataboutism. But the reality is that Marjorie Taylor Greene is not only not going to pay a political price for, her speculation about Jewish space lasers, she is about to become far more influential and powerful in this House Republican majority. She will get all of her committees back, won't she? They are going to be
Absolutely.
promoting her.
Yes, and Kevin McCarthy is using her to whip votes for him. I mean, she's becoming a key lieutenant to leadership, and I think that the lesson is to any other aspiring politicians out there that you can't go too far in terms of conspiracy and crazy assertions that will generate attention, will get you onto Fox News, and that it will be your source of power.
I know that you need to run to Nancy Pelosi's press conference, so thank you for making time for us, and we'll look for your reporting on it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Charlie. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We'll be back tomorrow, and we will do this all over again.